So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. So, my name is Houshang Golshiri. I'm Houshang Golshiri's daughter. My father, as you may know, never left Iran, although he suffered a lot because of his writings and his activities in favor of freedom of speech and against censorship. I am really, really grateful to Abbas Milani, Abbas, and Stanford University for this event and for safekeeping all of my father's writings in one place. But I should admit that I feel a shade of sadness thinking that this ceremony would maybe never take place in Iran. I was in Afghanistan last year, and every young Afghan I came across talked with a lot of passion about Houshang Golshiri's books. And through that enthusiasm, I understood that his works have touched a lot of lives. So that's why I wish to follow his optimistic attitude towards life and hope that one day we would be able to have the same ceremony in presence of his friends, his colleagues, his comrades, even those who have chosen exile, not in Tehran, but in Isfahan, the city he loved dearly. So our next speaker is Shahriar Mandanipour, who is an acclaimed contemporary writer. He has written 9 books of fiction and 1 non-fiction book. Right now, he teaches creative writing as a visiting professor of the practice at Tufts University. Mr. Mandanipour, please.
Hello, everybody. I would like to say my thanks to Dr. Milani and Stanford Iranian Studies because of creating such a beautiful event, and after years gather us together. It was so beautiful. Thank you. And I want to take back Miss Farzaneh Taheri apologize about her bad accent, bad pronunciation, because I am going to show what is bad pronunciation is. So you are so perfect, and it is a still night, Mr. Golshiri. I had recently returned from the war alive, when with the help of my professor, Dr. Abbas Milani, I was introduced to Golshiri. The first time that I met him was at his house. Dismissed from teaching at the School of Fine Arts, he was then a stay-at-home father. I read one of my stories to him. It was then when he started to review and analyze that story that I realized that my patience was being rewarded. The patience of years and years of persistence in writing and hiding all of my exercises and my development from the eyes of the others. I was rewarded because he was one of the best, worthiest critic and reader in all my life. While making tea, he said, "I don't believe in writing prodigies. Although I wrote the Princess Job when I was only 28. And I couldn't figure out whether a little bit of that admiration was attributed to me or not." I was 28 years as well at that time. His criticism wasn't like that of typical critic. In Thursday story reading sessions, he let his fictional imagination run away into the story. In his moments of epiphany, he could read even the subconscious of the story. This is a kind of critic that encouraged the author to read, author or reader to search for underlying layers. He mentioned frequently in the story reading sessions that the writer should never hit the spot, but rather should take aim off of or away from the target. He mentioned the dart. I think that when Golshiri expressed his idea of aiming to miss, Hemingway's Immovable Feast wasn't yet translated, and the American author's iceberg approach or theory to writing with only 1/8 of the story visible to the reader had not been raised. By not hitting the bull's eye, the writer will find the opportunity to carve circles around the bull's eyes and create additional targets. This off-aim writer leaves the rest to the imagination of today's limited readers and tomorrow's unlimited readers, who, as we know, are smarter. The unique off-target style of Golshiri's is even detectable in his first works, especially in the stories in the short collection, My Little Prayer Room. In the title story, the spine of the story, or the central object, is the red piece of flesh with no nails situated next to the narrator's left little toe. Golshiri transforms this mini finger to a metaphor to express alienation and point both to the melancholic philosophy of Camus in his novel The Stranger and to the science fiction version of it. The plot of My Little Prayer Room is the self-portrait of a 35-year-old man who narrates the minor incidents of his extra finger, or as the narrator states, it is something that separates me from others. During his writing life, Golshiri created many brilliant stories with powerful plots. Although the plot of My Little Prayer Room is not one of his best, I believe it embodied Golshiri's writing manifesto and the center of his attention from his young age until he died. Let us read some parts. I only look for and wish for things that I really want. Besides, I think that everything has something extra or something missing that it is more important and more interesting than the thing itself. That if it is seen, if everybody can see it, you would say that it is extra. When it becomes part of that thing, part of its structure, then it is laid bare in the sunshine. Like a room that has only 4 walls, a ceiling, and no shelf. Yes, that is the loneliness and most beautiful room that you can imagine. If I were a religious man, I would certainly build myself a little prayer room. In such an oppressed and censored society as Iran, the 6-fingered man, or even Golshiri himself as the writer, will be rejected or denied as soon as he reveals his differences and stops censoring himself. The instinctive and unconscious fear of alien in close encounter of the third kind in the root of this social rejection. It happens among even some insider writers that they were opposed to censor, they were opposed to government regime. For some of them, so a few of them, Golshiri was outsider. Let's read another part of his work. Her name? No need to mention it. Just like this piece of flesh next to my little toe on my left foot that I won't allow any stranger to see. The next morning, she woke up before I did. She was sitting by the bed on the floor, looking at my feet. I suppose that I woke up from the touch of her two cold fingers. She asked, "What's this?" I said, "What?" I pulled together the toes on my left foot in such a way that she would forget she had seen them. She had seen it, so it was over, and she was finished with me. Generally, in Iran, the definition of fiction writer is still under the influence of Romanticism school. It looks like as Victor Hugo's spirit possesses the characters and ideas in most contemporary stories. In contrast to this typical practice, Golshiri brutally exposes the hypocrisy, weakness, and imperfection of the characters in his stories, and doesn't even spare these intellectual characters. His prose tries to take off the mastic coat of the ordinary literature and expose its true literariness. Defining his enigmatic style is challenging for readers. His prose is not familiar, but tries to defamiliarize the settled syntaxes and stereotype forms in Persian literature. He's writing, "Did you ever record your dreams to see, for example, if you are in love? Sometimes literature has the same role. I started Christine and Kid with the intent of understanding what's going on in the world and what is my role. That was my most brilliant experience in writing. By shaping the story, I was forming myself and my relationship with the others." Notice how narrator of My Little Prayer Room feels honored and superior despite his disillusion and sadness, because nobody else has that finger. To him, it is unique, like the little princess Rose. Once I wrote about Golshiri that he is unique just like the little princess Rose, mentioned Antoine Saint-Exupéry novel. I wrote about Golshiri that he is unique, just like the little princess Rose. But I wrote, as does every rose, he had his thorns as well. I know some of his fans didn't like that comparison, although he never mentioned it, but I hope he had understood his compliment. After all, it was said in his own blunt language. His roof, frankness, and his penetrating eyes that saw into the essence of people and exposed that they hid behind their masks made him plenty of enemies. His spoken language was the same as his written critics. His style of critique was based on methodological criteria with a standard and systematic review. But unfortunately, he himself only received rude and offensive critique from others. Golshiri once told us that he had seen a left-leaning critic in a bookstore. He was one of those who accused Iranian modern literature of ignoring social aspects. They had noticed that mourners of Bayal in that bookshop. Mr. Politico-social critic mockingly had referred to the book and said, "What kind of literature is this? There is no way a human being transforms into a cow." And Golshiri, without any pause, he said, "Why not? For instance, you yourself." You may not find this supportive signature of that critic, who is apparently on the side of the people fighting for freedom of expression and democracy. You couldn't find any supportive signature of such a leftist critic in the history. But Golshiri and other people like him, who were accused of dwelling in ivory towers, signed many petitions. Most of the time I saw Golshiri holding a petition or an open letter of protest that he was going to send to cities around the country for collecting signatures. The famous statement by 134 writers, "We are writers," was one of those. One of the important characteristics of Golshiri's prose was his detail-oriented power of observing. Not seeing oneself as the noblest of all creatures or at the center of the world is still not established in Iran. Therefore, it is not surprising that the holistic perspective and analogical method of thought is the dominant mental process of Iranians. If the modern first person had been introduced to Iran's literature by Milani, then Golshiri was the pathfinder of this movement. In Thursday storytelling critic sessions, Golshiri quoted Nima as saying, "If I could picture through an artistic description of alga growing under a bridge in a village, then the reader can imagine the whole village." It was from Nima. In The Mirrors Without Doors, Mina was picking up an autumn leaf from the ground and encouraging the narrator to observe it carefully. Then she threw the same leaf away and asked him from the book, "Now look back and see. You may not find it anymore. Well, this is our problem. But I am now thinking that I should bend or even sit on the ground and look at one leaf meticulously, as if you put it under magnifying glass and you want to detect every capillary of every network of it. This is a tribute to the fall." Golshiri's style is to gaze intentionally into the world and make an effort to see its capillaries. Another feature of Golshiri's literature or his legacy to Persian literature is his attempt in motivating the subjective story. If Hidayat was the sole helpless writer who opened the door to this kind of a story in Iran, Golshiri is one who continued in this vein with his own style and with blind old narrators. There are only a few perfect realistic love stories in Persian modern literature. Most of them, contemporary love stories, fall into sentimentalism just like their classic counterparts. All we have in poems or prose is limited either to admiration or to flirting with the mystical lover's fantasy. The poet only takes pleasure in walking around the lover's mole. The writer neither possesses initiative enough to move upward to the mind and thought of the lover, nor courage enough to touch down from that pot. But Christine and Kid is one of the few successful stories that could handle all the difficulties of creating a love story without being caught into sentimentality or romanticism. As we can expect, unfortunately, Christine and Kid is not appreciated in Iran. That pro-social critic recognized this novel as the result of Golshiri's sexual obsession and fantasies. According to Contempt and Sexually Depraved Mind of such a critic, according to the Contempt and Sexually Depraved Mind of such a critic, the only problem with this novel is about something outside the story, that it is whether or not in the real world Golshiri had sex with somebody named Christine or not. Another feature of Golshiri's story, or better said, one of his concerns was that a story should not be representational in a limited way, but should instead signify to another signified. In other words, the story should have latent potential for different meaning so that it can be released into different times and circumstances. The best example of this concept is in his first innocent story. In this story, the villagers make a scarecrow to scare crows away from their fields. But as time passes, they talk about the scarecrow, making rumors about it, attributing nightmarish imagery to it, and in so doing, turn the scarecrow into a monster, of whom all of them are afraid. Isn't this a familiar, repetitive story in our history? Making a scarecrow and they afraid of it. He said, yes, we are sad, or I am. I know, but that is what it is. Maybe the next generation could talk about more cheerful things. They may talk about the grass, or the grass as an entity, a grass that it is the symbol of nothing. I very much miss you, Mr. Golshiri. For us writers, At least the hell of this world had Thursdays. If I could be sure that the other side's hell was holding Thursday story reading sessions, I would buy a bus ticket to its Tehran just to read you a story. You had no choice, Mr. Golshiri. You were doomed to display your sixth finger. That finger is also known as genuine literature. Mr. Golshiri, there is no Thursday in Iran anymore. It is said that it is always Friday. It was a still night when you left. It is now even more nighter. It is now even more nighter than before. Thank you so much.
So our next speaker would be Monsieur Reza. Sorry, French is coming out. Reza Farokhfal. He is an Iranian author. These days he teaches Persian language and civilization in the University of Colorado Boulder. And so, Mr. Farokhfal, yes, please.
Thank you so much. First, let me begin by stating my admiration for the Stanford Persian Study Program for funding such an archive. It is, I should say, it is a very unique project achieved by a very unique academic institution in the field of Iranian studies for the first time. In my view, it is not just an archive of manuscripts. It is also, or from my view, it's a chance for us, all of us, to see the traces, some traces of agonies and the sweats of Golshiri's souls at the scene of writing. I would also like to extend my special thanks to Professor Milani for giving me this opportunity, of course. I remember that I first met Dr. Milani at Houshang's and Farzaneh house on Apadana, I suppose. Yeah, it was a couple of months before or after revolution. And since then, I have been an avid reader of all of Professor Milani's works. And I learned a lot from him. So I would like to extend my thanks to Houshang's soul for gifting me with such a friendship. Let me start with this sentence, little bit a strange sentence. Golshiri died his death, and it was a shock for all of us. What do I mean by this? Let's say death is the last signature of a writer. Writer put this signature on the last page of his works. So, by signature, I mean the very singularity of Golshiri as a writer, his otherness among the other writers of his generation. After his death, I remembered him a lot. And it was my question, or better to say, my preoccupation. I asked myself that now, in his absence, after his death, how can I read his signature? And by this, of course, I mean his very characteristic trait in Houshang Golshiri works. And I ask myself, does it pertain to some technical aspects of his writings, of his works? Yes, I should say yes, but it is not the whole story. I will explain it. This peculiarity, very characteristic trait in Golshiri, was it some sort of political, ideological engagement or commitment? Some sort of self-imposed mission? Not at all, I should say. Was it his awareness and treatment of or national identity, something that I like to say, or Iraniyat? And if you let me, I put it in English like this, or Iranianity. Yes, but at the deeper layers of his works, layers of signification in his works. I dare say that Golshiri, after Hidayat, was the only writer with such a preoccupation, with such a obsession. Of course, we do have another figure, our dear Bahram Beyzaie here, with exactly with same preoccupation, obsession, let's say passion. But he's a playwright. I mean writers of fictions, not playwright. So, through my remembering after his death, I remember that there was always something about Houshang Golshiri. And strangely, something that we as his friend, we did have a feeling about it. But when he was alive, when he was working, we didn't need to name it, but we did a feeling about it. What was it? Let me give you some examples or more explanation. You know, in our literary sessions, in our literary discussions, and sometimes our fightings, he was physically with us, but he was not. He seemed that he lived somewhere else, in a daze, hunted. I know that Farzaneh remembered this characteristic of Houshang. Where was he? I asked myself. Let me put it, my feeling in Farsi for you, and I like to imitate Houshang's style of writing. Bale. No. I jumped over. Let me. Suddenly I found that this beautiful word in Farsi, with strong connotations in Hafiz and Sadi. And the word and the term is ahd. Ahd. Let me put it in the Farsi syntax and say that it seems to us, or it seems to me after his death, that Houshang had an ahd with somewhere, as we say in Farsi. Now let me put something in his style, imitate his style. بله او در کار عهدی بود با کسی یا جایی ما نمیدانستیم که آنجا و یا آن کس کجاست یا کیست و یا آن عهد بر سر چیست اما بود و ما نمیدانستیم که هست اما نبود و ما آن را بر زبان نمی آوردیم. Excuse me. Okay. Then I come across a term in a French philosopher, yes, Jacques Derrida, which I found, oh my God, how can I use it to explain this concept of ahd that Houshang had? And the concept was and is promise. So, yes, I am so fond of Derrida because he had a great influence in literary theory here in the US. But I should say immediately, I'm fond of him because I don't understand him. For sure. Now, at the same time, after that, I found a beautiful line in Sadi. And I found that, I could use this beautiful line to explain the concept of promise as aporia. And the line is this. بعد از تو ملاذ و ملجئی نیست هم در تو گریزم گریزم. Ignore the first part. I mean the second part. هم در تو گریزم گریزم. I explain. And I remember a short piece that Houshang published before the revolution in a literary monthly under the title Ishqbaz, Kaftar Baz. We can translate it as pigeon fancier. And I found again that, oh my God, how beautifully Houshang fictionalized what we say in Farsi, wafay be ahd, fulfillment, a promise. I read for you that. So, but let me define what I mean by promise first. It differs from covenant, a biblical word, or which in biblical sense. It is not spiritual, about a spiritual experience. We do have this concept in our mystic tradition, in Hafiz, for example, when he says about Ahd Qadim. But here, what I mean by promise is something very profane, literary, secular. Because in speaking about modern literature and Houshang Golshiri as an instance of modern literature, we are speaking about secular magic as modern literature. It is unsayable. You can't find any articulation about it in Houshang works. And no wonder, as his friends, we didn't mention it. We didn't need to name it when he was living. Unconditional and impossible at the same time. You know, when you promise something in the realm of your possibilities, you make an agreement. This is not a promise as such, in this sense. Huh? And it is a very riskful experience or an act, because in any given moment might be failed and not to be fulfilled. Let's read the Sadi line, Misra. Ham dar to gorizam, gorizam. Expression of aporia, expression promise as an aporia. How? He said that if I escape from you or dare escape from you, I escape to you. What does it mean? It's like saying a rectangular circle. You can't escape from somewhere while you are turning back to the same locality or personality or whatever. So, and this is a conditional phrase. Ar is a contract form of agar, or as we teach in our Farsi classes, it's a if clause. But as an if clause, a conditional phrase, it is not a constative statement, rather it is a performative statement. And what does it mean? It doesn't report about an event or something which is happened or something which is happening, but it involves you as a force in what is happening or what would be happened. Okay? And then look at the dar proposition, dar togarism. This is a very strange function of dar here. It marks the destination of goriz, escape, as whole corporeality of who? Of mashuk, loved one. I would like to say dost. Dost, another beautiful word in Farsi. Okay? First I thought that maybe Sadi here again adopted some Arabic proposition. Sadi liked to do this, you know. He adopted some Arabic proposition in Farsi and conveys a sense of strangeness in his style. But in Arabic, they do have farra min and farra ila, but not farra fi, there. So this there is it means that the amorous subject here promised to do something, not condition, not to make a condition with do's. He promised to do that I can't escape from you. Something like this. It is not a paradoxical line or a poetic statement that you can find in Hafiz or Bidel, for example. Like motionless move in Bidel, those kind of things. It is something like what Yadullah Royai says, when mother dies, she never dies. Another aporia. Some of the, in regard to his technique of writing, some of his critique says that Golshiri couldn't write a story in conventional way. I remember? Yeah. Actually, as far as we now have his text, we don't know about his struggles or whatever agonies of writing and about in his something beyond his textuality. No. But I dare say that it is a misreading of his signature, because Golshiri promise here. We can also read his effort as a promise in setting up something in challenging with mimesis that we have learned from the West, rooted in Aristotle poetics. What do I mean by this? He did this by, something completely different from what the conventional poetics prescribed, like in terms of the linear sequence of events in the story, the cause and effects, again, chain of events in a story, and logicality of beginning, middle, and ending. Golshiri liked to do something to write an ending precede the beginning. He presented fragmented temporality, present tense in his works. And I should like to say, he tried to project the past as a memory into the future. Or remember his frequent use of subjunctive form and subjunctive mood in his writings. To date an event oscillating between the past and future. So, it was another example and manifestation of promising something impossible. But Golshiri did it. So, let me, if I want to repeat the question that came to my mind, promise what and promised whom or to who? So let me say that he made a promise to Dost, as we use in Farsi. But what did he promise? This is another question. The Ishqbaz piece as a short story. Later, Golshiri put it as an episode in his unfinished novel, برای گمشده راهی. It starts with this sentence. My father was a pigeon fancier. پدرم عشقباز بود. And the whole story is about a bet on pigeon. You know, a kaftarbazی as a sometimes as a forbidden hobby. And the whole story is told by the first person singular, the son, about his father and his father's favorite pigeon, Sinesor, red chess. But Golshiri described this scene of this story and this bet or gamble as a ritual. The setting is the narrator father's place. A group of pigeon fanciers have been invited to his ritual. There is a feast with alcoholic drinks and opium. The participants, including the father with his favorite trained pigeon, start the bet by flying their pigeon. Then winner will be the pigeon that can fly the longest. And here you will read beautiful pieces, descriptive pieces by Golshiri, which demonstrates his mastery of prose writing. At the end of the day, in the late afternoon, the father's favorite pigeon has not come home, and father lost the bet. The guests are about to leave the feast, making sarcastic, annoying, and bitter remarks about the unfaithful runaway pigeon of the father, the red chest. It appears as though the red chest will never return. She might have been picked by a falcon or seduced by another pigeon, a male pigeon, on her way back home. However, the father and the son are still waiting, and finally, it is the son that could see the red chest as a tiny white spot in the sunset sky that calls his father and calls his father. The red chest is back, but wounded and bleeding. The bird is dying. She is almost dead, but she's back. We read that the father is trying hopelessly to sew her bleeding wound with a needle and a thread. And we read in a story in Farsi, زخم را می‌دوخته با سوزن و نخ و گریه می‌کرده. There are the last words of the story. These are the last words of the story. Now, how can I Golshiri's signature as a promise? I think we can also find answer in the very moment of his death, which happened, as you know, after one of the dark period in history after the revolution, after those so-called chain of murders of killing of his friends. First of all, Ahmad Miralai, then Muhammad Mukhtari, and then Puyande, Jafar Puyande. Golshiri was not kidnapped. He was not kidnapped and killed, but he died immediately, almost after the death of his friends. Let me read my conclusion that I wrote for an essay, an article about Golshiri, to explain again his death as an example, example وفای به عهد, fulfillment of a promise. And I read this piece in Farsi for you. But promise what? He made promise, yes, to Dost. And also he made a promise to future. Let's say freedom as a future not realized yet, but a future to come. No, I read as conclusion my Farsi piece. نزدیک خانه ما توتستان عظیمی بود با درختانی تناور که عصرها پر از جیک و جیک گنجشکان میشد. این توتستان محل بازی ما بود. در همسایگی ما پسرکی بود از یک خانواده مرفه الحال که گاهی با یک تفنگ بادی نشانه زنی از خانه بیرون می آمد و چند تایی گنجشک شکار می کرد. با دقت و گزیده می زد. بعد کله هایشان را می کند و آنها را در کیسه ای می انداخت. یک روز تفنگ بادی جای خود را به یک تفنگ ساچمه زنی داد. با هر شلیک این تفنگ لحظه‌ای جیک و جیک گنجشکان قطع می شد، سکوتی عجیب و بعد فوجی از گنجشک مثل میوه‌های رسیده از شاخه‌ها فرو می‌ریخت. ما برای پیدا کردن لاشه‌های گنجشکان به پسرک کمک می‌کردیم. شگفتیم که در میان لاشه‌های خونالود به تک و توک گنجشکانی برمی‌خوردیم که هیچ جای شکافتگی و خون بر بال و پرشان نبود، اما گویی که از نهیب مرگ آنهای دیگر آنها هم مرده بودند و از شاخه‌ها فرود افتاده بودند. خودشان را به مردن نزده بودند، واقعاً مرده بودند. این را چشمان بیفروغشان در دستان ما می گفت. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Farokhfal. So our last speaker is Mr. Abbas Milani. I think he doesn't need no introduction, but who is the Hamid and Christina Mogaddam Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University. Abbas Milani has been a real close friend of Houshang Golshiri and the translator of one of his most important works, Night of the Benighted. King of the Benighted, sorry. Ay Milani.
Good afternoon. Golshiri used to start many of his talks with an anecdote. So let me start with an anecdote. I had begun teaching at Tehran University, and I had a 3-hour class. And I had been teaching in the US before I went back. So after about an hour and a half, I gave a break. And I was standing right outside. Hamid Enayat, who was a colleague, was very worried. He came by, he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "It's a 3-hour class. I've given him a break." He says, "No, never give him a break. They leave." So some of our colleagues left. They, I think, did themselves a great disservice. Before I begin my talk, I want to thank one other person who I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to, and this is Miss Nasiriha. I don't know whether she has left or whether she's still here. She left. She designed the poster and she designed the program. She also designed something that I want to tell you about. There has been several references to Mokhtari and his unfortunate passing. In about a month, we will be staging a play written and directed by Mr. Rahmaninejad, which is about Mokhtari. He has been resurrected from the dead, and he will talk about his passing. So today, we are talking about two people who have been directly or inadvertently killed by the Islamic Republic, but they're all phoenix-like, resurrecting and will resurrect more in future. The posters also designed by Nasrin Khanum, are available. The time of the play and the place, the time is on there, the place we will announce shortly. I borrowed half of the title of my book, my talk, from a brilliant play by Tom Stoppard, The Coasts of Utopia. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It is a remarkable 3-part, 9-hour almost, production. I saw it in London when it was first produced. It was reproduced in America, and because Americans have less patience, it was reduced to about 7 hours. And it is about the intellectual life in Russia in 19th century, and about the dangers of utopianism and the follies of messianism. And that's the aspect of Houshang Golshiri's work that I want to talk about. So the work is called The Coast of Utopia, The Shipwrecks of Utopian Messianism in Golshiri. I think it is far from hyperbole to suggest that for over 150 years, the most important question facing Iranian society, Iranian intellectuals, Iranian clerics, has been the question of modernity and many of its incumbent debates. Is modernity something desirable? Is it something Western? What does it consist of? What does a modern Iranian writer do? Where does a modern Iranian playwright or a modern Iranian story writer get its heritage from? How do you get that heritage? How much agency do we have? Are we as individuals agents of our own future, or are we subjects to forces, whether divine or secular? Are there messiahs, whether they call them the Communist Party of Iran, Vali Faqih, Reza Shah, or the intellectuals, Jalal al-Ahmad? They all shared one common theme. They thought they were the messiahs. They thought they had the answer. They thought they were leading this group. What is the place of art in all of this? Must art be an instrument to any of these projects, whether theological or secular? Or is there a place for art as aesthetics, art as an expression of individual sensibilities, individual desires? If an artist gives his or her individual perception of the world, is he or she a petit bourgeois engaging in tazabzub bourgeoisie, or does she or he have a right to say, this is my view of the world, if you don't like it, take a hike. Don't kill me, don't buy my book, don't come to my play, I have a right to see the world this way and describe it. In other words, art as a manifestation of individual autonomous sensibility. Aesthetics as a choice made by the author or artist, not by any force outside this domain. These, I think, have been some of the most recurring issues of the last 150 years of Iranian history. I think if there is one conceptual construct that can help us navigate through these, this might well be that conceptual construct. And I know of no writer in the realm of fiction who has intervened in this debate more cleverly, more intuitively sometimes, and sometimes more learnedly. Oftentimes, he would say something intuitively, and he would later find in readings that he would do, in Western theories that he would seek, the theoretical justification of what he had said. Sometimes in these discussions that we had, these Tuesdays, we would have a discussion about something, and he would say, oh, I've said this in such and such. Who has said this? Jacobson has said this. Let me read it. And he would go and find and enrich his own rich vision. And I say this with no hyperbole, that I know of no one in post-revolutionary Iran who has contributed as much in this debate and has contributed as much in what I think will be an enduring way. And I'll tell you why I think that. Of all the aspects that his writing is very rich in, I'm going to concentrate essentially on two aspects, on Messianism and the idea of utopianism. And these two are very interconnected, as I will try to argue. In the debate about modernity, if you follow the debate about modernity in the West, one of the most serious discussions has been the question of whether there is something really genuine about modernity. In other words, is modernity fundamentally, radically a rupture from tradition? Or is modernity essentially either a continuum from tradition or a secularized form of theology? There is a great debate, one of the defining debates in 20th century in terms of political theory, between two figures. I won't bore you with the detail. One is Blumenberg, one is Karl Löwit. Karl Löwit says there's nothing new about modernity. Everything modernity says are secularized forms of Christian theology. Marx talked about the proletariat. That is the secularized version of the return of Jesus Christ. They talked about the communist future. That's the secularized version of the apocalypse. And on and on and on. It's really a fascinating. So theology becomes, in this narrative, a form of ideology that claims to be a rupture. Others say, no, there is something different about modernity. There are some continuities, but there are also some distinctive characteristics. Golshiri, I know for a fact, long before having ever read Blumenberg, having ever read Löwit, makes these arguments in his books in a remarkably astute way. And the more, one of the pleasures of anticipating this conference was for me rereading his work. And reading his work, I realized once again how truly rich and demanding but rewarding they are. I had been reading, and I'm going to use that reading to some purpose here. I had been reading for the past 4 or 5 months, very carefully, very closely with one of our students. One of, I think, Golshiri's masterpieces. No one has ever talked about this piece today. I think this work stands aside along with Shaz Dehtijab as a masterpiece of Golshiri. It is called Hadith Morde Bardar Kardan on Savar Ke Khahad Amad. I'm going to end my discussion with a little bit of reference to it. It is a remarkably dense and a remarkably rich work. The language is singular. The language is brilliant. The structure is like a very complicated piece of jewelry where every little sentence has a light of its own, and that the more you look at it, and every time you look at it, and you look at it from a different angle, the lights differ. If you look at the Iranian modern experience, whether it is modernism, which is what Golshiri was very great at, which is essentially aesthetic innovation. Modernism is where form is content, where you manifest your content through form, or whether we're talking about this whole question of modernity, the question of changing society as a whole, a society in which, again, one of the defining characteristics of modernity is what Blumenberg calls self-assertiveness. Modernity is when we become self-assertive. When every individual says, I have a right to stand in this world, think about this world myself, come up with answers myself, and construct an aesthetic rendition of this world myself. I don't give a damn what the church says, I don't give a damn what Wali Faqih says, I don't give a damn what Savak says. This is my view of the world. Take it or leave it. This self-assertiveness, Blumenberg says, is the single most defining characteristics of modernity. That's what turns us from subjects of vali to citizens of a democracy. That's what turns us, I think, more than anything else, a citizen of a modern republic of letters. When Golshiri wrote some of his criticisms of those writers who were following Russian realism rather than their own instincts, he was basically telling them, you haven't yet reached the age of a modern writer. You haven't yet become self-assertive individualist writer. You haven't become a petit bourgeois individualist. And through this petit bourgeois individualism, he essentially realized the revolution that I think he helped realize. He wasn't alone in this revolution. The revolution that Golshiri was part of actually begins before Golshiri begins to write. Golshiri manifests this in the realm of fiction. In the realm of theater, Bahram Beyzaie began it. And they all begin about the same time. And I'll tell you how they began it. It isn't because he writes nice proses or women are important in his. What I mean to say is something entirely different. He comes around and says, the root of Iranian modern theater is neither in Russia nor in Chekhov. There is some root we have in Iran. We got to dig it up and get our modern play from it. He who has not a bone of religious sentiment in him, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, he goes and looks at ta'ziyeh and finds in ta'ziyeh the elements of a modernist theater. Zenderudi in painting, Parviz Kalantari in painting, go to the same root. They say our modernism shouldn't come from Picasso. We should know Picasso. We should know Impressionism. But our modernism should come from Saqwakhune. Our modernism should come from calligraphy. We can, out of our traditional calligraphy, make a modern painting. The same movement happens in architecture, where the new wave of architects say, we shouldn't emulate Frank Lloyd Wright. Why make houses in Tehran that have no logic of their own? Who the hell makes a house in Tehran with large glasses? This is hot in summer, cold in winter. We have bricks, and they're beautiful. And we have arches, and are beautiful. And you have a new structure of architecture. And about this time, Ibrahim Golestan begins to write things that then Golshiri continues and takes to a completely different level. Golestan begins to say, the root of a modern fiction, prose, isn't necessarily the West. It's in Sa'di. Which modernist writer taught that Sa'di could be the source of a modern writer, modern fiction? When Golshiri decided to start a story at the end, he wasn't emulating any Western modelist. I know for a fact that he said, Bayhaqi is what we should do. He says, look at Bayhaqi. He calls his story Hadith Morde Bardar Kardan Hasanak Wazir. He tells you the end of the story in the first title of the story. And then yet he makes a profoundly involved story. So Golshiri begins, I think, continues, I think, this true new modernity in Iran. In some ways, my sense is that Iran as a society is today going through the most profound experience of modernity in all of its 150 years. And Golshiri is one of the most important standard bearers of this modernity, this new modernity. A new modernity that is both inward, first and foremost, but also outward. It knows the West, it reads Joyce, but it also reads Quran. In our Tuesday discussions, I remember Golshiri talking about how he said, I'm going to write a stream of consciousness that takes as much from the Quran and of the Hadith literature. He began to reading the 13th volume of Bahar al-Anwar, a composite of utter often nonsensical stories, but beautifully told in a way that he said reminds me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. When I first heard that he wants to take a step beyond Gabriel Marquez from Bahar al-Anbar, I thought he had gone one step beyond. But that's what his modernity was about. His modernity was as steeped in Persian tradition as he was in the West. The story that I had the good fortune of translating, King of the Benighted. You can't read King of the Benighted and not think that this is Ulysses. This is one day, or maybe 10 years, or maybe 1,000 years in the life of one Iranian or Irish, or the history of intellectual suffering in that tormented land. I don't think he had read Ulysses when he wrote this. I'm not sure. I don't remember when he had read it. But even if he had read it, he took it and turned it into something completely different. Joyce did it in 900 pages. He did it in 90. And it is a brilliant book, both because it is global in its style, in its formalist experimentation, but also remarkable in how, to go back to my initial point, he conjures tradition. He says, why not go to Nizami Ganjavi? Who said that the stream of consciousness for us has to come from Nizami Ganjavi? Again, to go back to one time when we were reading Nizami Ganjavi, he deconstructed the first 70, 80 lines of poetry from Nizami and said, look, the point of view in this 70 lines of poetry changes 6 times. He said, Joyce couldn't do this. You change the point of view. The point of view is who is the narrator? Where is the time of the narrative? He changes it. Nizami changes it. So Golshiri learned from Joyce, but learned more from Nizami. And out of this, with the alchemy of his truly brilliant prose, that I think is singular, not just because it's pithy, but it's also because it's so supple and so full of, so redolent of imagery, so redolent of tradition. Golshiri is of that rare generation of Iranian artists who didn't believe that genius was enough to make it in the world. Genius has destroyed more Iranian artists, ended them up at the end of a pipe or at the end of a bottle than oppression has. Golshiri believed genius only works if, following T.S. Eliot, you follow tradition. You need to delve into tradition. You need to know everything your tradition has, and then you need to take it one step further. And I think his remarkable modernity is to no a small measure steeped in this and defined by this. But Golshiri, I think, had also a rather remarkable knack, and is one of the first people, I think, to notice the complete parallel that exists between Islamic Messianism and secular Messianism. It is today a commonplace, I think, I hope. It is today a commonplace to say, it doesn't matter if you're expecting the return of Mahdi or you're returning of the Communist Party to lead you to salvation. In both, you have nothing to do with this. In both, some force outside you. You're in a stage of expectation. Golshiri understood what I think has been a 150-year central problematic of Iranian history. In some ways, you could say it began with a woman, with Qurratul Ain, who said the age of expectation has ended. We are the gate to our own freedom. Golshiri takes this and says, it isn't just the Imamzadehs who are teaching us these false expectations. These intellectuals who claim to be the messiahs, these intellectuals who look down upon us, where they claim to be serving us, where they claim to simplify the language because they want to talk at our level, but they're actually humiliating us because they think we are not smart enough to understand their more so-called complex thoughts. Golshiri is the most democratic of the committed artists of his generation, because he's the only one who trusted them to understand any level of complexity. He said, I count on the platonic intuition of the reader. I give them an illusion they understand. They don't need for me to spell it out. They don't need for me to be their preacher. He created what no committed artist of his generation was even interested in creating. That is a hermeneutic partnership with the reader. The committed artist did not want the reader in any form other than a passive, obedient reader of the message, an implementer of the message. I simplify it in the language that you, in your simple-mindedness, can understand. Your job is to take the message and go exercise. There is no agency in this. There's no democracy in this. This is a form of totalitarianism. This is a form of messianism that eventually begets totalitarianism. The true writer that is democratic is a writer that says, you and I are responsible for meaning of this text equally. I'll give you a little hand, the rest is yours. And he doesn't have the arrogance to think, I am the owner of this text. We are the owners of this text. And with this kind of a hermeneutic partnership, he helps create a democratic readership. Out of simple literature, out of simplified literature, you get simple-minded readers. Because the assumption, the false assumption, is that readers are simple-minded. Golshiri had more respect and got more cursed by those who advocated themselves to be liberators of the masses, for respecting the masses. The same critics that attack Golshiri, attack Bahram Beyzaie for his Arash. They praised to the hilt Siavash Kasrai, whose Arash is a messianic monster. Golshiri did much the same with every messiah that he could find. Some literary critics at the time accused him of being a petit bourgeois, of not understanding, of being an anti-communist, sometimes fearing, I think, their attack. He pulled some of his punches so that they don't find an excuse to attack him even more. But nevertheless, I think he opened the path. I think he opened the path in a kind of literature, in the kind of republic of letters that creates citizen readers, not subject readers. That citizen readers that are as responsible and as important in affording meaning to the text as the author that has made them. Now, I want to end, it's been a long day, I wanted to end by talking about two of his very important works. And I'm going to only talk about them very briefly from this aspect. One is called Shahriar. It's translated into English as King of the Benighted. And I have to say that, I think I can say this here for the first time, that the translation was seen by Golshiri. I found a way of getting it back to him to have his view. He read and sent extensive commentaries on this. I'm desperately trying to find those commentaries so we can contribute them to Stanford. And incidentally, if any of you have letters from Golshiri, if you have fragments, if you have taken books as gifts from his house, please give them to Stanford. We will keep them. This is a gift from someone, Mr. Shadzi, who has given this to Stanford. He has given us a bunch of some of his holdings. Others are promising to give. So please, let's try to make this as exhaustive a source as possible. We won't censor it. We won't interfere with it. And if the family permits it, we will open it as soon as all of you want to access it. The book that I think has been truly underappreciated is Hadith Murd Bardar Kardan. The other book that I think has been also underappreciated is Barre Gum Shode Ra'i. Barre Gum Shode Ra'i is truly prophetic. It basically predicts the Islamic Revolution, folks, and predicts the disaster that is coming, and offers reasons for why this disaster is coming. Look at the title, Barre Gum Shode Ra'i. That is the theory of Vilayat Faqih in 3 words. We are all the lost sheep of the faqih, of the shepherd, Ra'i, the shepherd. We are the lost sheep. And in a brilliant part of this novel, I know why they don't allow it. There must be some idiot in the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. If there ever was an Orwellian name, it's the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. It's the Ministry of Ignorance called the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. But there must be some idiot there who knows this is a description of what is coming 10 years before it's coming. This is, you can't find a better description of Khomeini's theory than Barre Gum Shode Ra'i. This Gum Shodegan need a shepherd. The shepherd is either the Communist Party or another Reza Shah or the intellectuals who think they own the society or Wali Faqih. They all share one thing. They think we are the lost sheep. And Golshiri says, you're all the same. And he also shows the devastation that this messianism has brought to everyday life. He shows how utopianism is absolute recipe for totalitarianism, and how failed utopianism ends up in disasters. It ends up in shipwrecked homes. Whether he's describing a family in Germany, or whether he's describing a group of his comrades in Iran hiding, trying to find the next recipe for the revolution, or whether he, in Hadith Murd Bardar Kardan Savar Ke Khahad Amad, he goes through 3,000 years of messianism in Iran. He begins from the Zoroastrians and comes to the Islamic and then reinvents it in Marx. It's the only book I know where you can find direct quotations from Karl Marx and Quran and every other messianic huckster that has been of influence in the last. In Shah Siapushan, he does the same thing. He looks at utopianism. He looks at the dangers of utopianism. Again, today we say the young generation of Iranians have learned a lesson. They have learned the lessons of the dangers of utopianism. They have learned that you can piecemeal change maybe better than changing something where you don't know what the alternative is in future. That is the message that is in Golshiri's work. That is a prescient prediction of what is coming. The idea that if you read Shah Siapushan, Shah Siapushan would not have been Shah Siapushan. His life would not have been miserable if he hadn't tried to have perfection. Attempts to create perfection beget gulag. Attempts to change society piecemeal gets a democratic polity. To get this democratic polity, you need democratically trained citizen readers. And Golshiri wasn't just a teacher, a good teacher for this brilliant writer. He was a teacher for a whole generation of people who read him. Because you can't read Golshiri unless you're a dedicated reader, unless you're a dedicated Democrat who believe I am responsible to make this happen. Let me end by just concentrating on the title of, I could literally, I've heard from Barbad that someone whose work I very much respect has written a book about حدیث مورد بردار کردن سوار که خواهد آمد. We tried through Barbad desperately to get him to come here. He refused. We even used Mr. Beyzaie's name because they said he had been a student of Beyzaie. That didn't work. We begged. We said Skype. It didn't work. So maybe one day someone will write the book that is absolutely needed, the many books. We have one scholar at Stanford who might be writing a PhD dissertation that is mostly on that book. She is in this audience. I'm not sure she wants me to mention his or her name, but she is here, and she's been working. Sounds like one of these jokes. If you tell me how many people I have in my bag, I'll give you both of them. So I want to just take maybe 3-4 minutes and talk about the title of this book, حدیث مرده بردار کردن سواری که خواهد آمد. Every aspect of this title is both enigmatic and pregnant. Hadith is a religious concept. Hadith is about religious stories. The origin for the word secularism in English language is expropriating religious concepts and domains. That's where the word secularism comes from. The word secularism means, after the Protestant Revolution, secularizing church ideas and church territory. Golshiri, by using hadith for a short story, is secularizing the very concept of hadith. He's telling us that there is something beyond just the hadith. You don't own hadith. I, too, have the right to own it. That's what secularism means. Golshiri is one of the most secularizing writers of modern Iran. Golshiri has done more for secularism than Hidayat has ever done. Much has been mentioned of Hidayat. I said there are writers whose posthumous fame will exceed. Hidayat, in my view, has one great book and a couple of very good books. The rest of his books are embarrassments. Golshiri doesn't have a single bad story that you would be embarrassed by. He has uneven stories. The thousands of pages that he hasn't published is because he was not someone given to just publishing because of the next paycheck. I also have to give you, before I go about Morde Bardar Kardan, tell you something about his true genius. Farzaneh referred to a stage where Golshiri had edit books for money. I was translating Master and Margarita from French and English. So I said to Houshang, I said, can you edit this? Houshang said, I don't know English or French. I said, well, I'll come and read it to you, and you edit it. They had a little attic house in the apartment. It was extremely hot in summer, extremely cold in winter, but it was private. Barbad wasn't running around. Ghazal wasn't speaking. I would read passages for him. He would listen, and he would offer suggestions. And then he would occasionally say, are you sure this is correct? This is the right translation of this word? And I was translating from English and French. Every time, by intuition, he picked up my mistakes. Because he knew a writer would not write this in this place. That is how he saw the world. That's the vision that he had. His ability to edit without looking at the text. Hadith, I said, is a truly secularizing story. And the story is about secularizing the notion of messianism and the dangers of messianism and the pervasiveness of messianism from the time of Zoroastrianism to the time of the rise of Islam to the time of Marxism to the critique of the Gotha program that Marx is writing, from where he literally quotes some passages, and you would never know it if you don't know that this is where it comes from. You would think this is some hadith that he has conjured. No, he's taken all of them, and with the alchemy of his ability, is undermining the very idea of a Messiah. And by the time you get through with it, you realize you are your only Messiah, because if you can get through this, hadith مرده بردار کردن سواری که خواهد آمد. Think about this. مرده بردار کردن can be read two ways. It can be read the story of hanging a dead person, مرده رو بردار میکنی. Or it can be read as hadith, every rider who comes will be hung. Every rider will be hung. Or every rider is hung before they come. In both of these, Golshiri means in both. If you read the text, he means it both ways. Messiahs are invariably false. And people who expect messiahs invariably kill those who do not deliver on this part of the Messiah or who stop the coming of the Messiah. And the Sawar ke khahad amad, of course, is every knight that we expect. The knight in shining armor, the knight in a military commander, the knight atop US Air Force, or out of Jamkaran. All of them are, in Golshiri's brilliant secularizing narrative, nothing but false promises and nothing but the abyss. And the way to get out of the abyss is to read a lot of Golshiri and watch a lot of Beyzaie. Thank you.
So we have about 25 minutes for questions, but you should raise your hand if you have questions, and then they will get you the mic.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Farokhfal. Yes. The promise you said, is it anachronistic?
Pardon?
Is it anachronistic? Is it belated? Because
No.
you know what you said is quite like what happens with Romeo and Juliet. They have an ahd, they have a promise, but it's always belated. One dies, the other comes later, and this pattern happens quite often in the story. And the same can be said about Golshiri's death. Mm-hmm. You said that it's.
I know that there is a view, as you mentioned, on promise, but I didn't mean that. I am absolutely try to apply this notion, this term, the way that I wanted to explain Golshiri, and to play with this word that we do have in our tradition as ahd, and promise that I found in works of Derrida. So it is my application. I know that it can be, say something, a promise is always already belated or whatever. Huh? But no. I mean promise as something, as a riskful act, or unsayable act, or those that I mentioned.
Thank you, all the three panelists. moved, inspired, and passionate again is understatement. I studied engineering for the entire life of mine, but literature was my passion. And I remember reading Kristen and Kid 10 times. Every time a different layer. Every time a different meaning to what Mr. Golshiri said. My question is to Dr. Milani. Are there any ways that there will be teachings, there will be any sessions that we can study Mr. Golshiri in a very scholarly fashion here at Stanford?
Well, we have a new person that has joined the Complit program here. The position has been funded by the Iranian Studies, and she's a comparative literature PhD, a very eminent Austrian scholar. She has done some work on modern fiction, but mostly she's written this really remarkable dissertation on Akhaban Sales, very close friend of Golshiri. So I'm sure there will be courses. I use King of the Benighted in at least 2 of my classes, but that's just one text. And I use it essentially to talk about the kinds of things that we talk about here. But in terms of the aesthetics of Golshiri, we haven't had a course here yet. What we hope to do is eventually get some funding to set up a fellowship where scholars who are working on Golshiri could come stay for a month, for example, at Stanford and use the archive. That is our hope. But there is a lot of work being done on Golshiri. And I learned this by accident in some ways. Stanford has done 2 searches for positions in the last year in areas related to modern Iran. And I was involved in both of them. I read some of the finalists. And there were at least 3 people who have written PhD dissertations on Golshiri. They haven't been published, but there is a new generation of scholars who are discovering that Golshiri is a minefield and a mine, both, because you can trip. If you assume that this is easy, you will trip. But there is this generation, and I think soon there will be people. That's what I truly mean when I say that I think in the next decade there will be a lot more scholarship and a lot more deserved critical attention to Golshiri. Part of the problem is very difficult to translate. To translate adequately Golshiri's work. Shahzad Tejab has now a new translation. I think it's the 3rd English translation. And a very prominent British writer and poet, and a big fan of Golshiri, and a good friend of Farzaneh, has translated, and it's very good. And when I met him, I also met Kid. I've actually met the Kid of the Christian and Kid.
The Kid or the Christian?
The Christian. Yeah. I met the Kid too. Yeah, we met them together. We met her together. We met her together once. Yes, the Christine of the story is now a very prominent politician, very prominent politician, and a big avid fan of Houshang. And I think she was responsible in doing the new translation.
That's cool. It seems like the methodologies and the mechanisms of modernism were used towards Iranian subjects. So the how of modernism was applied, not the why of modernism. The necessity, what gave it life was necessarily a Western imperative. So it was still something imposed upon the culture. So you cannot really call that necessarily either an Iranian modernism or modernism that comes out of our own culture, because it was actually superimposed. Like I said, this is a question that remains muddled in my mind, and
But I cannot accept that we basically parallel with or under the influence of Western modernism found our own way in modernism.
I'm going to do one better. We didn't parallel the West. We were ahead of the West. In many key components of modernity, as I've tried to argue in 2 or 3 books, and as Golshiri has written in several very brilliant articles, and as other people are beginning to write, there are several books about this. The notion that modernity is a Western project imposed on Iran is an idea that 2 people in Iran, 2 groups of people, have been advocating. The mullahs and the Western shallow-minded, intoxicated intellectuals who don't know, who they know modernity. Look at the areas, I can tell you about the areas that I've looked a little bit at more closely. I've looked at, for example, prose. The notion that a modern prose, a simple, eloquent, quotidian-inspired prose is a modern invention and comes in the West after the Renaissance. That's the trajectory. And so after Asr Qajar, if we want to learn simple Persian, we have to go to the Western models and begin to write in a new way. No. Bayhaqi, Hafiz, Sa'di, Shahnameh, Nizami are perfect plays. Biruni is a different aspect, and I'll get to Biruni again. Look at, they say the central idea of modernity in the West was the Copernican revolution. The change from a geocentric view to a new sense that says that we are but a small dust. Biruni anticipates this by 200 years. In 20th century, the Pope issued an encyclical apologizing for Galileo and saying that there is 2 realms, the realm of revelation and the realm of reason. And the church was wrong in using revelation to kill reason. It's a very famous encyclical. There is a translation of it in the New York Times, you can read it. Ibn Sina virtually, literally says this in his Dahr Saleh 1,000 years ago. Read some of the correspondence. Read the book called The Lost Enlightenment. And read some of this scholarly correspondence, philosophical correspondence between primarily Iranians. And what happens? The mullahs kill it, the Ash'ari version of Islam, the Mongolian invasion, and what is not killed by them, the Sufis kill.
So it did not have a chance to take root.
It did not have a chance to take root, and there was every effort made to obliterate it. Listen to the seminar we asked Professor Beyzaie to give about Sahibazi. Sahibazi was a very prominent form of theater in Iran 700 years ago. They killed it. It took Stanford and Beyzaie to revive it.
Let me tell you something. Of course, Houshang was the only person that I called him by the first name, Houshang. But Abul Hassan Najafi was, at least for me, was always Aghay Najafi. Even Ahmad Miralai, who was for some periods more closer to me, I was so close to him in compared with Houshang. Even I never called him Ahmad. I used to call him Ahmad Agha. You know? So I should say we did have this dignity, and we were, yes, harsh. And Houshang later continued this behavior in responding or in some context or in relation with some people that sometimes it was problematic for Houshang. because those guys were not his friends in Isfahan. We didn't have such a, but still, believe me, without frankly saying, we did have sometimes very harsh discussion and conflict, but with dignity. After that, it was finished. And yeah, I hope that I answered you. Yes. Oh, yeah.
We have to use the microphone because they need to get it into their system.
Sorry. Thank you very much for a very enlightening panel. Professor Milani, my question is about the inner relation between Shah Siyahpushan and Hadith مرده بردار کردن. We talked about the language and the spirit of both stories before in our direct studies, but I just realized that we were talking about the point of start and ending of Hadith مرده بردار کردن. And it's 1354 to 1358, which is right around revolution. And Shah Siyahpushan was finishing in 1366. And Iran-Iraq war ended in Mordad 1367, which was shortly, basically, after this novel. I wanted to know if you think there was also a reflection of these two big events within the inner relation of the language. As we said, like Bayhaqi and Nizami both having a strong presence in these two stories. Was there, you think, also an inspiration for the war and revolution both being at the end some sort of magic and magic that never actually was realized within the structure of the war?
In terms of the King of the Benighted, I really think, and Farzaneh can correct me, I think I can pinpoint the moment where Golshiri decided to write that story. In one of our Tuesday, we used to gather together every Tuesday, and we used to read things together, or read for each other. And before we would start, Golshiri would take Barbad and my son and run them around so that they're tired and they can sleep, so that the rest of us can have an adult conversation. And as he was doing this, there was a piece of paper was on the table, and that day it was at our house. There was a paper, Kehan. On the bottom corner of it, there was an item. It said, last night in Evin, a group of Taibin had been asked to execute their comrades, and as a show of their repentance, they had done it. And Golshiri was devastated. He says, have you ever heard anywhere where they get people to execute one another? This is a story. Kafka couldn't imagine this story. Fast forward 15 years, I get her handwritten story that eventually becomes the story of a utopian thinker whose name is Sarmad, Utopia, who's an advocate.
Ecclesiastical.
Yeah. Sarmadi, absolutely. And is a mujahid and is absolutely dedicated. And his job is to execute his comrades, to give them the coup de grace. And when he has to give the coup de grace to his beloved, who is half alive, he decides to accept execution and go. So in Hadith, you have a meta-narrative, historical narrative, about the traumas and travails of Messianism in Shahriar Houshang, you have it from the point of view of two people, a poet and a Sarmadi. And you see what this has done to the poet's life, to her life, to his life and her life in the everyday, where they have to get up and worry about death and witness death, and then also to the life of these messianic young men. So, and there, because I recently reread both of them, there are so many sentences that are intertextually connected and refer to one another. Somebody should really read one against the other and find how they echo one another and complement one another.
Thank you for your time and having this conference. My question is, this Messiah story that you mentioned, Dr. Milani, so it seems that it's what I thought, that it all has to be a kind of a group that they think in a way that's different, but they cannot affect, they cannot somehow control the community. But based on what you're saying, it seems that Golshiri was the only one that, based on what we see, at least in the revolution, around the revolution, that was not in this way. Am I right? Or there was a group that they think this way, but there was not that much connection between those groups and the people? And from when do you think that this thought was accepted in the community in Iran, that if you want to do something, we have to do it by ourselves? Do you think right now it's accepted, or we still need time to fix it? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think Messianism today has too many buyers other than in the supporters of Mr. Ahmadinejad who go to Chamka. They're considerable. They're not few. They're probably about 7 to 10 million people who still go there or will believe there, who are rentiers of the state. But you look at the Iranian society at large, I see very few of them who believe that out of a dry well, the Imam will come and redeem us. I just don't believe that. But at the time of the revolution, there were people who were already against this onslaught. There were writers who saw the danger coming. Mustafa Rahimi, we haven't mentioned Mustafa Rahimi. Mustafa Rahimi took enormous risk and said, look, what is coming is disaster. Sadiqi, Mullah Hussein Sadiqi, virtually predicted everything that happened and put his political life on line to try to abort it. Bahram and Beyzaie was against it long before many of these people were. I mean, you have to read Arash. He wrote Arash when he was 19. Am I right? Something like that. It's remarkable that here is an Arash that is chastised by the people because he said, look, folks, I'm not your liberator. If there is a liberator, you got to liberate yourself. There were these voices. One of the best gifts that Farzaneh brought from Iran for me was a collection of stories by what I think is, after the Khodat, the best satirist of modern Iran, bar none. And many of you might never have heard his name, and it's not your fault because he wasn't available. His name is Qain Dawood, Safa. And a collection of his stories are published. You should read those collections. He had a sense. Khalil Maliki had a sense of what this messianism can do. But the power of the Tudeh party and their thinking made of Khalil Maliki a monster. They still make of him a monster. Someone who virtually predicted everything that Hezbollah today eventually did. So there were these voices. I think the difference is now it's become a chorus rather than solitary voices chastised by the dominant discourse. And there were a lot of wonderful people in the dominant discourse who put their lives on the line. I don't mean to truly undervalue their dedication to the cause, but the fact that you die for a cause that begets darkness, if you had won, is our responsibility to point out, while appreciating the fact that they put their life on the line for that.